before CAAS actually came into being, whether one starts in 1962, 63, or indeed in 69, 1970. So it's a roundtable that continues the discussion that we began at Queen's last year, which really tried to understand how Africa was being represented in Canada before the association, our association came into being. So this roundtable continues. And the first speaker is Fraser Taylor from Carleton University. He will be followed by Myron Echenberg from McGill University. Myron will then be followed by Saul from York. La quatrième personne à parler sera Nathalie de l'Université du Québec à Montréal. And finally, we will have Chadya from the University of Manitoba. So let's begin with Professor Fraser Taylor.
Merci beaucoup, José. What I'm going to do is, I did not participate in the roundtable at Queen's. I wasn't very sure of what had been covered and what had not been covered. But I'm going to give you my impressions of the early years between 1962 and 1984. I will draw on some of the few literary sources that are available for that period. There are some. And also on my own personal reflections and recollections. There are others in the room, like Doug England, who have more experience of the early years, much more experience of the early years than I did. So if I make some errors in fact or opinion, I'm sure he'll be able to correct my interpretation or misinterpretation of what happened at that particular time. Now, the first formal manifestation of African studies in Canada was in 1962, when the Committee on African Studies in Canada was created. The formation of the committee, I'll just pause a couple of seconds there until this gets to Okay, I think we'll speak okay now. I just started introducing my topic by saying that I'm going to talk about the early years between 1962 and 1984, and drawing on some of the sources in writings that are available, and also on my own knowledge and interpretation of what happened. And the first formal manifestation of African Studies in Canada was, I think, in 1962, when the Committee on African Studies in Canada was created. The formation of the committee was encouraged and assisted by the Overseas Institute of Canada and the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. And the purpose was the purpose was stated as you can read on the screen. And I believe the first president was LeBlanc of McGill University. The committee at that time met with the learned societies, and the first meeting of the committee was held in 1963 at LeBlanc, in conjunction with Canadian Political Science Association, where the constitution of the committee was ratified. At the first meeting, a decision was made to publish the Bulletin of African Studies, and publication began in November 1963. What was the situation of African Studies in Canada at this time? In the first volume of the Bulletin, Ron Cohen characterized the situation as outlined in this document, outlined in this quotation here. As you can tell, he wasn't too impressed by the state of African studies at that time. I've entitled my paper "Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose," with a question mark. It's up to you as I go through the early history to decide what still applies and what does not apply in terms of the current situation of African studies in Canada. But I find, as we go through it, some of the quotations from the early year ring eerily true at present. Not this one in particular, but perhaps some of the others. Now, Don Savage outlines some of the progress made between 63 and 67. The Committee on African Studies held a number of annual meetings, independent of Lowland societies, and at the meeting of the committee in Sherbrooke in June 1966, a decision was taken to replace the Bulletin with the Canadian Journal of African Studies, with Don Savage as editor. The Bulletin had served a very useful function, including 2 bibliographic surveys conducted in cooperation with SHERP. The first was a list of African periodicals in Canadian universities, libraries, and the second was a list of Canadian government documents on Africa. These were both important markers, if you like, of where we were or where we were not at that particular time. The journal marked a very important step, and a very important step forward not only for African studies in Canada, but for African scholarship in general. Myron Echenberg, I'm sure, will say more about the journal as in his presentation. The purpose of the journal was to continue the work of the Bulletin and to print articles of scholarly nature, chiefly, although not exclusively, by Canadian studies. And it was become one of the major agencies for the promotion of African studies. Now, in 1967, Don Savage gave an outline of the progress that had been made. And he also introduced some of the challenges and debates about the future at that time. Some of these questions still remain today. Should African studies be an independent focus of study, or part of a more widely based international studies focus? What's the best timing for the annual general meeting? Should it be independent of the meetings of the Learned Society? Should there be regional groupings and meetings? Should there be a national centre for postgraduate work on Africa? Where is the funding for field work in Africa to come from? What is the importance of ensuring that undergraduate courses in African studies are given? And I found one of Don Savage's comments particularly interesting. I'll give you time to read it. In essence, he's arguing that African studies in Canada at that time was held up by the public perception or misperception, depending on your view, of the state of affairs in Africa. I would argue that we can substitute some of the countries in this quote, but that general idea is still very much with us today in terms of how the public perceives Africa. The autumn of 1969, as I'm sure others will comment, was a critical time for African studies in Canada. A joint meeting of the Canadian Committee on African Studies in Canada and the African Studies Association of the United States took place in Montreal with a Canadian, Peter Goodkin of McGill, as chairman of the organizing committee.